All right, so we're diving deep today and going deep into this book, The Body Keeps the Score,
Yeah.
by Bessel van der Kolk. It's a pretty intense one, but
Yeah.
we picked it for you because we think you'll find it fascinating. So get ready, because we're going to go beyond just the surface level. We're really going to try to understand how trauma shapes us in ways that we might not even realize. And to guide us through all of this, we've got our expert, who has made a career out of understanding the science behind these really powerful experiences.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I think you guys are going to be really surprised by how much van der Kolk's work like changes the way we think about trauma, especially when it comes to understanding people who've been through some rough stuff.
Yeah, one of the things that really stood out to me was how van der Kolk connects the experience of war veterans with those who've endured childhood abuse. He says that for many, the war begins at home. That's a powerful statement.
Yeah, it is. And it really changes how we look at trauma that happens in childhood. Think about it. For someone who's, been abused, home isn't a safe place. It's like a battleground. And just like soldiers in combat, they're always on edge dealing with this invisible enemy that can just pop up at any time.
So it's not just about the initial event. It's how that experience kind of keeps shaping their lives long after the abuse has stopped.
Yeah, exactly. Van der Kolk actually uses some pretty intense animal studies to back this up. He calls it inescapable shock. Basically, researchers would repeatedly expose these animals to something painful with absolutely no way for them to escape. And it's a tough thing to think about for sure, but it gives us this crucial insight into how trauma actually works.
Okay, I need you to explain that. I'm 5 years old.
Yeah.
So does this mean that if you've gone through trauma, you're just doomed to feel helpless forever?
Not necessarily. While it's true that, going through trauma over and over can make you feel helpless, the good news is our brains are really adaptable. Van der Kolk's book is all about how we can rewire those ingrained patterns of fear and helplessness so we can get our lives back.
That is reassuring, but I'm guessing it's not exactly easy. How do you even begin to change something that feels so deep-rooted?
Well, that brings us to Van der Kolk's next big point, how trauma messes with our brains. He describes it as a hijacking, where your emotions completely take over and the rational part of your brain can't get control.
So it's like your brain gets stuck in emergency mode.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
When we experience trauma, especially as kids, it can really mess with how our brains develop. We end up with this super strong stress response, and it's hard to control our emotions. This helps explain why people who've been through trauma might overreact to things that seem small to others. Their brains are basically still wired for that fight or flight response.
That makes a lot of sense. But if trauma affects us so much on a biological level, does that mean talk therapy won't help?
Not at all. But it does show us where talk therapy has its limits. Van der Kolk says that just talking about it can sometimes be like trying to reason with someone who's in a full-blown panic. You can't just talk them out of their fear. You have to deal with those physical reactions their body is having.
So it's not just about changing our thoughts, it's about changing how our bodies react to those thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where Van der Kolk's look at the body gets really important. He takes us past just the brain, and he shows us how this invisible war he talks about is happening in our bodies too.
Okay, now I'm really interested. How does trauma actually show up in our bodies?
Well, one way is through something called alexithymia. This is where people struggle to identify and express their emotions. Imagine feeling this knot in your stomach or your heart racing or even chronic pain, but you just can't connect those feelings to any specific emotion.
I see how this all connects. If you've learned to just shut down your emotions to cope with the trauma, your body finds other ways to show that distress.
You got it. And that disconnect between your mind and body can make you feel like you're not even in your own body. It makes it so hard to feel safe and secure. It's like you're constantly at war with yourself.
That sounds incredibly isolating.
It can be. And this leads us to another really important part of Van der Kolk's work, the importance of attachment. He builds on the work of John Bowlby, who showed how our early relationships shape our emotional patterns. And for people who've experienced trauma, those patterns can be full of insecurity and fear.
That makes sense. If you've never had those safe and secure attachments when you were a kid, it's got to be hard to learn how to trust and connect with people later on.
Right. And Van der Kolk points out this one attachment style that's particularly problematic. It's called disorganized attachment.
What makes it so problematic?
Imagine a child whose caregiver is the source of both fear and comfort. It creates this impossible situation. They want to be close to the caregiver for safety, but they're also terrified of them.
So their source of security is also the source of their fear. That's heartbreaking.
It is. And it can have effects that last a lifetime. This disorganized attachment can lead to struggles with relationships, your emotions, and even your physical health.
So we're talking about way more than just bad memories. We're talking about something that changes how a person interacts with the world and even their own body.
Exactly. And that's why Van der Kolk's work is so groundbreaking. He's showing us that trauma isn't just something that happened in the past, it stays with us, in our brains, our bodies, and our relationships. But the good news is there's hope for healing. And we'll explore that more in a bit.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. But where do we go from here? If trauma is so deeply embedded, how do we even begin to address it?
That's the big question, isn't it? And that's where Van der Kolk really shines. He doesn't just give us a diagnosis, he gives us a map to get to healing. And you might be surprised by some of the things he suggests.
Okay, I'm all ears. We've talked about the limits of just talking about your problem, so what else is there?
Well, Van der Kolk questions how much we rely on medication. He's not totally against it, but he sees it more as a temporary fix. It might help with the symptoms, but it doesn't get to the root of the problem, the trauma itself.
So if pills aren't the answer, then what is?
Van der Kolk dives into this whole world of alternative therapies. Many of them focus on working directly with your body and your nervous system. One that really caught my eye is EMDR. That stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Have you heard of that?
Honestly, it sounds kind of like science fiction to me. You're saying moving your eyes can help heal trauma. I'm a little skeptical, but I'm listening.
I get it, it does sound strange, but the basic idea is that by focusing on the traumatic memory while you're also doing something like moving your eyes from side to side, you're basically helping your brain process the trauma in a way that's less upsetting.
So you're not erasing the memory.
Yeah.
You're changing how it makes you feel.
Exactly. And while we don't totally understand how EMDR works, the research shows that it can be really effective for a lot of trauma-related issues.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this goes beyond just talking about your problems. Are there other approaches that work with the body like this?
Definitely. Van der Kolk is a big fan of yoga, especially for trauma recovery. He sees it as a way to reconnect with your body, build strength and flexibility, and regulate your nervous system. And of course, there's mindfulness, which can help you become more aware of your thoughts, feelings, and what's going on in your body.
I've tried mindfulness meditation before, and I can see how it can be good for calming anxiety. But can it really help with something as deep as trauma?
Van der Kolk believes it can. It's not about pretending the trauma didn't happen. It's about learning to observe those thoughts and feelings without judging them, which creates space for healing to start.
That makes sense. I'm noticing a theme here. It seems like we're moving away from approaches that are only about the mind and moving towards ones that involve the body too.
You're picking up on something really important. Van der Kolk argues that trauma isn't just something that happens in your mind. It's a physical experience that gets stuck in your nervous system. So healing has to involve the body, too.
Earlier you mentioned that Van der Kolk highlights something called the ACE study, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. Can you tell us more about that?
Oh, yeah. That study was groundbreaking. It showed that difficult experiences during childhood, like abuse, neglect, or growing up in a dysfunctional family, are way more common than we thought. And what's even more important is the connection they found between those experiences and long-term health problems.
So you're saying there's a link between what happens to us in childhood and things like heart disease, diabetes, even cancer.
You got it. The ACE study found that the more bad experiences a person has in childhood, the higher their risk is for all sorts of physical and mental health issues down the road.
Wow, that's pretty heavy. I guess it really shows how those early years shape us in such big ways.
Absolutely. And it makes it clear how important it is to address childhood trauma, not just for the individual, but for the health of our society as a whole.
We've been talking about individual therapies, but Van der Kolk goes further than that, doesn't he? He talks about needing what he calls trauma-informed communities. Do you unpack that for us?
Yeah, this is a huge part of what he's saying. He argues that we need to stop blaming and shaming people and instead create systems and institutions that understand how common trauma is and support healing.
So instead of saying, what's wrong with you, we start asking, what happened to you?
Exactly. It's a completely different way of looking at things. Imagine schools where teachers are trained to recognize the signs of trauma in kids and respond with compassion. Workplaces where employees feel safe to talk about their experiences, and healthcare systems that treat the whole person, not just their symptoms.
That sounds like a big idea, but also like a really important one.
It is a big idea, and it would take a huge change in our culture. But Van der Kolk thinks it's essential if we really want to deal with how widespread trauma is.
All this talk about rewiring the brain and the body is fascinating. But it also sounds like a lot of work. What makes van der Kolk so sure that healing is even possible?
That's a great question. Van der Kolk sees how resilient humans are as something amazing. He's seen firsthand how people can heal from even the most horrible trauma. It's not about forgetting or erasing what happened. It's about incorporating those experiences into a new story of strength and wholeness.
So it's about moving forward without letting the trauma define you.
Exactly. And he gives lots of inspiring examples of people who've done just that.
I have to say, I'm finding all of this pretty hopeful. It's easy to get bogged down by how dark trauma can be, but van der Kolk reminds us that there's light at the end of the tunnel.
That's the best part of his work. He doesn't avoid the hard parts of trauma, but he always points us towards the possibility of healing and becoming whole again.
You mentioned earlier that van der Kolk explores all sorts of alternative therapies. Could you tell us a bit more about some of those? I'm especially curious about sensory-motor psychotherapy.
Yeah, sensory-motor psychotherapy is really interesting. It's an approach that focuses on the body, and it helps people become more aware of what they're feeling in their bodies and how that connects to their emotions.
So it's about reconnecting with your body and learning to listen to what it's telling you. What does that actually look like?
It can use a lot of different techniques. The therapist might guide the client through exercises where they pay attention to their breath, notice any tension or discomfort in their body, and explore how those feelings connect to their thoughts and emotions.
So it's like mindfulness, but with a specific focus on the body.
That's a great way to put it. The idea is that by becoming more in tune with their bodies, people can start to manage their emotions better and feel safer in their own skin.
That sounds like a gentle way to approach something as complex as trauma.
It can be, and it can be incredibly powerful too.
We've talked about EMDR, yoga, mindfulness, and sensorimotor psychotherapy. Van der Kolk also talks about using theater as a therapeutic tool, right?
He does. He explores programs like Shakespeare in the Courts and the Theater of War, which use theatrical performances to help trauma survivors process their experiences and connect with others who've been through similar things.
I can see how being part of a play could be a way to express emotions that might be too hard to talk about directly.
Exactly. It gives them a safe and structured way to explore those feelings and to connect with people who understand.
There's also this program he mentions called Creating Survivors Theater, which works with foster kids who have experienced trauma. Can you tell us about that one?
That program is particularly powerful. It involves having the kids create and perform their own plays based on what they've been through.
That sounds incredibly empowering.
It is. It gives them a voice and a way to tell their stories, and it helps them to feel like they have control again.
It seems like van der Kolk is really emphasizing how important it is to find creative ways to express and process trauma.
He is. And he's open to trying anything that might help people heal, whether it's traditional therapy, body-oriented therapies, or creative expression.
I'm struck by how van der Kolk isn't just focused on fixing what's broken. He also wants to help people find new meaning and purpose after going through trauma.
That's a key part of his message. He says that trauma can shatter our sense of self and how we see the world, but finding a new purpose can help us put those pieces back together and give us a way forward.
So it's about more than just surviving, it's about thriving.
Exactly. It's about figuring out how to make the trauma part of your life story in a way that lets you move on with strength and resilience.
I love that. It's so easy to focus on the negative side of trauma. But van der Kolk reminds us that there's always the possibility of growth and transformation.
He does. And he encourages us to be curious, to try different things and see what works for us.
It's like he's saying that healing is a journey, not a destination.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
You know, something that keeps coming up in our conversation is this idea that the body remembers trauma in ways that our minds don't always get. It's almost like our bodies have their own memories.
That's a really insightful observation, and it's something that van der Kolk stresses throughout the book. He talks about how trauma becomes a part of our nervous system, affecting how our bodies react and often leading to a disconnect between our minds and bodies.
He uses this metaphor of the body being a battlefield, where the fight against trauma goes on long after the actual event is over.
Exactly. He says that a lot of people who've experienced trauma feel unsafe in their own bodies. They might be super alert, easily startled, or overwhelmed by physical sensations.
He even tells a story about a woman who was constantly picking at her skin. People kept telling her it was self-harm, but for her it was the only way she could actually feel anything.
That's a perfect example of how the body tries to communicate what the mind can't. And it highlights why van der Kolk is such a strong believer in therapies that work directly with the body, like yoga sensor motor psychotherapy, and even dance and movement therapy.
These therapies give us a way to bridge the gap between our minds and bodies and to start feeling safe and in control again.
He also talks about the role of the vagus nerve in all of this. The vagus nerve is a big nerve that connects the brain to the body, and it's super important for controlling how we respond to stress.
Okay, hold on a second. What's the vagus nerve? And why is it so important when we're talking about trauma?
Think of it like a communication highway between your brain and your body, especially the parts of your body that control stress, like your heart and lungs. When it's working right, it helps you feel calm, relaxed, and connected to other people.
But you're saying trauma can mess that up.
Unfortunately, yeah. Trauma can throw the vagus nerve off balance, which leaves people stuck in a state of either being super on edge, that constant fight or flight mode, or the opposite, a state of shutdown where they feel numb and disconnected.
So it's like being trapped in either extreme alertness or complete shutdown, neither of which is good.
Exactly. And that's where things like deep breathing, mindfulness, and yoga can help. Kolk suggests that these practices can help regulate the vagus nerve and shift your nervous system into a state of safety and calm.
So it's not just about relaxing. It's about teaching your body to feel safe again.
You got it. It's about giving your nervous system a chance to reset and learn that it's okay to relax and feel safe.
This is all starting to click for me. But I have to ask, if trauma can affect us so deeply physically, how do we know if we're actually healing? What are the signs that things are changing?
That's a really important question. Kolk talks about a few key indicators of healing. One is being able to control your emotions better. So instead of being overwhelmed by anger, sadness, or fear, you can feel those emotions without them taking over completely.
So it's not about getting rid of emotions altogether. It's about being able to handle them.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between being flooded by emotions and being totally shut down. Another sign of healing is feeling more connected to your body.
You mean like being more aware of what you're feeling physically and feeling more comfortable in your own skin?
Yes. It's about taking back your body and making it a safe and welcoming place, instead of a source of fear or discomfort. And lastly, Kolk talks about how important it is to develop a feeling of safety.
What does he mean by a feeling of safety?
It's about feeling secure and grounded in your body, even when you're dealing with challenges or stress. It's knowing that you have what it takes to cope with tough situations without falling apart.
So it's like building up an inner strength that lets you go through life's ups and downs without being totally thrown off course.
Exactly. And this feeling of safety doesn't just happen overnight. It takes time, patience, and a lot of kindness towards yourself.
Kolk also seems to really emphasize how important social support and connection are for recovering from trauma.
He does. He thinks that feeling safe and connected to others is absolutely essential for healing. Trauma often makes people isolate themselves and withdraw, but connection can help bring back a sense of belonging and make those feelings of shame and loneliness less intense.
So it's not just about individual therapy. It's about finding a community where you feel understood and supported.
Exactly. And that could be a support group, a close group of friends, a spiritual community, or even a therapist who really gets you.
He also talks about the healing power of storytelling, right?
He does. He believes that sharing our stories in a safe and supportive environment can be really therapeutic. It helps us process what we've been through, make sense of it, and connect with people who understand.
And he mentioned some really interesting programs like Shakespeare in the Courts and the Theater of War, which use theater to help trauma survivors tell their stories and connect with others.
Those programs are amazing examples of how creative expression can be such a powerful tool for healing.
It's pretty amazing how something as simple as telling our stories can be so transformative.
It is. And it reminds us that healing doesn't always have to involve complicated therapies or interventions. Sometimes it's just about finding a safe space to share our truth and be heard.
I think this is a good spot to pause for a bit. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still so much more to explore. We'll be back in a minute to dive even deeper into The Body Keeps the Score. Okay, welcome back to our deep dive into The Body Keeps the Score. We've been talking about how big of a deal trauma is and the many different ways people can heal that Kolk explores, but he doesn't just stop at talking about how individuals recover, right?
Right, he wants us to think bigger, to look at the systems and structures that can either make trauma worse or actually help people heal. He imagines a world where instead of asking what's wrong with you, we ask what happened to you.
That's a huge shift. It means moving away from judging and blaming people, and instead trying to understand them and be compassionate. But how do we actually make that kind of world where people are aware of trauma? Seems like a really big challenge.
It is, but van der Kolk gives some inspiring examples. He points to models like the sanctuary model and the ARC framework. ARC stands for attachment regulation and competency.
Can you explain those a bit? What makes those models so special?
Well, these models focus on how important safety, connection, and learning new skills are. Imagine schools where teachers are trained to see the signs of trauma in kids and respond in a caring way. Workplaces where employees feel safe talking about their experiences, and healthcare settings where they treat the whole person, not just their symptoms.
So it's about making places where people feel seen, heard, and understood.
Exactly. And it's about teaching people the skills they need to manage their emotions, build healthy relationships, and deal with stress in good ways. It's a big job, but it starts with each of us becoming more aware of how trauma affects people and speaking up for change in our communities.
It's like a ripple effect.
Yeah.
If we can create these little safe havens of support, maybe we can change the whole culture.
I think that's the hope. Van der Kolk reminds us that we are wired for connection, and connection is what heals us.
I love that. We've covered so much today, but like with any deep dive, there's always more to learn. If you had to pick one main takeaway for our listener, what would it be?
That's tough. But I think the most important message is this: healing from trauma is possible. It's not always easy, and it doesn't always go in a straight line. But if you have the right support and you're willing to put in the work, you can change.
And remember, you don't have to go through it alone.
Yeah.
Reach out to a therapist, join a support group, or talk to a friend or family member who can listen.
Van der Kolk says the greatest source of resilience is having caring and supportive relationships. So take care of those relationships and don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it.
This has been an incredible deep dive into The Body Keeps the Score. It's a book I think everyone should read. We've talked about some heavy stuff, but I hope our listener is leaving feeling informed, empowered, and hopeful.
Me too. Van der Kolk's work really shows how strong the human spirit is, how we can heal and thrive even after going through really tough times.
And to our listener, we encourage you to keep learning about this topic. Check out the show notes for more resources and info. Until next time, keep diving deep. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into The Body Keeps the Score. We've been talking about how trauma affects us so deeply, and all the different ways van der Kolk says we can heal. But he doesn't just talk about individual recovery, does he?
No, you're right. He goes beyond that. He challenges us to think bigger, to look at the systems and structures that can either keep trauma going or actually help people heal. He pictures a world where instead of asking, "What's wrong with you?" we ask, "What happened to you?"
Yeah, that's a powerful shift. It's about moving away from judging and blaming and moving towards understanding and compassion. But how do we actually create that kind of world? A world that's aware of trauma. It feels like a pretty huge task.
It is huge. But van der Kolk offers some inspiring examples. He talks about models like the sanctuary model and the ARC framework, which stands for attachment regulation and competency.
Can you break those down for us a little? What makes them so special?
Well, they really emphasize safety, connection, and learning new skills. Imagine schools where teachers know how to spot the signs of trauma in kids and they respond with care. Workplaces where people feel safe talking about what they've been through. And healthcare settings where they treat the whole person, not just their symptoms.
So it's about making environments where people feel seen, heard, and understood.
Exactly. And it's about teaching people how to manage their emotions, build healthy relationships, and deal with stress in healthy ways. It's a big goal, but it starts with each of us becoming more aware of how trauma affects people, and then speaking up for change in our own communities.
I like that. It's like a ripple effect.
Yeah.
If we can create these safe and supportive spaces, maybe we can start to change the entire culture.
Yeah, I think that's the hope. Van der Kolk says we are wired for connection, and connection is what heals us.
That's a great quote. We've covered a lot in this deep dive. But like with any deep dive, there's always more to explore. If you had to pick one main thing for our listeners to take away, what would it be?
That's a tough one, but I think the most important message is this: healing from trauma is possible. It's not always easy, and it might not always go in a straight line. But with the right support and the willingness to do the work, transformation is possible for everyone.
And remember, you don't have to do it alone. Reach out to a therapist, join a support group, or talk to a friend or family member who can listen.
Van der Kolk reminds us the greatest source of resilience is having caring and supportive relationships. So nurture those connections and don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it.
This has been a really incredible deep dive into The Body Keeps the Score. It's a book I think everyone should read. We've talked about some heavy stuff today, but I hope you're walking away feeling informed, empowered, and hopeful.
I hope so too. Van der Kolk's work is a powerful reminder that the human spirit can heal and thrive. even after facing incredible challenges.
And to our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep learning about this. There are more resources and info in the show notes. So until next time, keep diving deep.